VenomousStare back with another edition of a StarCraft 2 replay cast between pro gamers. This time we have two top-tier Korean players in my favorite matchup, Zerg vs Terran. In the top left here we have the exceptionally talented macro Zerg, Dark, a guy who has consistently made deep GSL runs, a player who can do both aggressive and macro builds equally well, and the sort of player that you want to copy builds from. In the bottom right we have Maru, widely considered to be the best Terran player in the world, the sort of player who had an entire year of absolute dominance to his name. This is one of the four horsemen of Terran, and again, a guy that you should learn from if you're a Terran player. Maru fluctuates between exceptionally aggressive builds and macro builds, which in my opinion, those are the sort of players that are the hardest to play. The guys who can do the most extreme as far as aggression versus macro and do it exceptionally well, and then go to the other side of the spectrum and also do it exceptionally well. With most players, it's one or the other. Only the extraordinarily talented can do both equally well. Maru is known for his drop-heavy bio play as well as his proxy 2-racks aggression versus Zerg. Whenever you play Maru, I would say that there's about a 50-50 chance that he's going to proxy barracks and do a bunker rush. We can see he had an SCV patrolling at the 3rd, while the Reaper was going across map. This is something you should copy if you're a Terran. This way you don't have to worry about scouting the 3rd with the Reaper. You can just run in and see what's going on. Check the gas. You always want to see how many guys are mining on gas here, because it indicates to you how intent the Zerg is going to be on going drone heavy, or whether they are going to tech up quickly. Maru actually gets a drone and then runs away. Reaper Expand has been so common for so long, most people can't even get a drone anymore. Zerg has gotten so good at playing defensive, which was really the theme of the last 4 months of the game. That has just caused endless kvetching from the Reddit community specifically, because Zerg players have really gotten down how to play defensively and work their way into the late game and macro very well. Go into the late game Zerg composition of Broodlord and Fester. 3rd base coming here very quickly for Maru as he starts to get Hellion. Now at the very high level of ZVT, one of the things you want to look out for is how many Hellions these guys are going to make. Although the tried and true standard is 6, I've seen Maru make a couple and then he will lift this off and get extra units. Well, another thing that I see Maru do, or I've seen him do at least once rather, is he'll do 2-1-1 and get 2 medevacs, and then he will lift the starport off the reactor so he can get a 3rd barracks making extra bio. It's sort of these very intricate corner-cutting little things that Maru does to synergize with his ability to macro and micro phenomenally and catch people a little bit off guard. Zerg players in many regards are players who do the same thing over and over and over again in regards to spreading creep and making drones and playing defensive. So if you take the best micro player in the world and do short little adjustments, small little tweaks in the build that can really help you get out a certain extra amount of units at a certain point in the game, frequently that will throw the extremely practiced Zerg player off, because not only are they playing against someone who micros essentially perfectly, they have an unusually high amount of units at the time, and whenever a race is doing very well and is somewhat favored in the metagame and sort of has the matchup figured out, taking these tiny little edges, doing these slight little variations is something you can do to help catch your opponent off guard. So much of what Zerg does just heavily relies on cutting as many corners as possible, squeezing out as many drones as possible, and that oftentimes is something that really revolves around hundreds of games of experience against certain styles. Zerg players just practice extensively against very similar pushes, similar builds. Terran players, they are creatures of habit, they're methodical players, and frequently they're copycats. And Maru is sort of the guy that leads the way with that. As far as people copy Maru, Terran players look to Maru to figure out how to beat Zerg, how to beat Protoss. It's interesting to me we don't see combat shields started here yet. Combat shields, of course, very important when you duel with Zerg. When you consider that these armor and attack upgrades give an extra point of damage and defense, the fact that combat shields gives 10 HP is just absurd, but of course he does start it quickly. Notice how much creep spread Dark has before Maru really pushes. The Hellions are really to keep him safe versus Ling Bane aggression, whereas when you get 6 Hellions it's more to run around and deny creep spread. Maru is starting to aggress, he's starting to clear a bit of creep, but we don't see a scan. He's going to push up into the third, Banes are being made, and a gaggle of Queens comes forward here and defends. And if we look at the bases, Maru did have scan there, and he does do a scan here. Usually when Terran does their initial drop, you see a scan right away. A lot of what Terran does to Zerg in the early game and mid game is a lot about clearing creep and sort of enabling other attacking options later in the game. If you just let Zerg run hog wild and spread creep unabated, it can be very difficult, because you get to a point where you want to do a push and the creep is halfway across the map and it's going to take you 2 minutes to do anything. Notice how Dark immediately runs that Ling away before it can die. Maru trying to clear more creep, but with this much map control and Ling Bane already out with a lot of Queens as a backbone, Dark will be able to fend off pushes on creep. However, Maru will drop just off the creep, but this is what I mean. Look how far the creep is out already. Maru has to drop all the way at a vacant 4th base, but he's going to fly into the main here. Notice the Viking cleaned up the Overlord path, so this is one thing all Terran should copy, is if you open with the Viking and click it around the Zerg's base in these areas, then it makes drop play way harder to defend. Maru loses the tanks, but he does pick off the spawning pool rather. And that is exceptionally important. It prevents Zerg from making both the Queen and the Ling, two incredibly potent defense mechanisms that Zerg relies on heavily. So I'm going to watch a little bit from the first person here, because whenever BlizzCon replays get released, I think it's very fun to be able to watch the Korean players who don't really stream a lot, their first person point of view. Now I know some of these guys stream infrequently or they stream on Afrika, but it's not really the same as a consistent Twitch stream. One of the things that we saw in BlizzCon is, I'm going to kill the music here actually, because we're not going to be talking about so much the game for the rest of this cast as we're going to be talking about BlizzCon. I have sort of framed the matchup in the proper way so you can understand it, and I'm going to sort of let Maru's point of view speak a little bit, and then I'm going to go over to Dark's as we see more Raxes being added. I'm going to flip over to Dark here. So a lot of the StarCraft community was pretty disappointed with BlizzCon in terms of the way StarCraft was treated. If you just look at BlizzCon overall, the production value was absolutely dog shit for StarCraft 2. The observing was terrible. You basically had a guy who didn't have any clue how to observe on a fold-out table. Let me drop the volume here. I think it's a little high for casting. You had a guy basically trying to observe for 50,000 people on a fold-out table with the scuff set up and no idea how to observe. And let me just show you an example of the worst thing an observer can do. Let's just say hypothetically that this little push is going to hit something. Now a terrible observer, and this is the reason I bring this up, is because this is something that a bad observer will do intentionally to be cute. This isn't like pointing out someone getting supply blocked or something that's an accident. So a big engagement goes down and they shake the screen, almost to say, like, hey, remember me? Remember me? I'm the cameraman. Think about me. Instead of just letting the game speak for itself. Remember, when you're observing, you're nothing more than the cameraman trying to display information. You're trying to show everything that occurs in the game, as we see a drop being denied down south. But For whatever reason, bad observers think that they have to call attention to themselves and do these intentional screen shakes as though it makes the game more hype or more interesting. And it just makes you look like a witless cretin. It makes you look like, look at this, oh, it dropped. It drops out today. I'm going to shake the screen like I have Parkinson's. And we saw that multiple times as whatever retard was observing just didn't have any fucking clue what he was doing, as you see both players are maxed out here. And I'm not saying I'm at a BC. I'm not saying I'm the best observer there is or anything, but what makes me so is just terrible micro there by Maru to disjoint half of his army on the creep low ground. That really frustrates me because that's an unforced error. That's something that only a complete moron would do, and that's something that's done intentionally. As a bit of Hydra Bane comes forward here, and Niduses are attempting to being made, but Maru has everything under control for the moment. He's trying to push up onto this fourth base, has a few tanks. But the observing was terrible, and there's really no excuse for that. You can't have some dumbass who doesn't know how to observe sitting there on a fold-out table and a scuffed mouse shaking the screen on purpose for BlizzCon. BlizzCon is the most prestigious tournament in the world, and remember, the observer is extremely important in StarCraft 2. Without him displaying the correct information, what are you doing? What are you watching? You know, you can have the best games in the world, the best casters in the world, but if people can't watch it, it doesn't matter. So another thing I want to talk about is the casters themselves. You know, I don't want to be too BM to some of the StarCraft 2 casters, but the death of Jeff in Control Robinson really stood out here at this event. That is to say that In Control is so ridiculously talented and was so good at making his co-workers better that whenever you watched BlizzCon this year, you could really notice, wow, In Control not being here makes a huge difference. Because not only was In Control a top-tier caster, as far as active casters go, Artosis and maybe Tasteless are the only ones that even come close to him. But as a host and as a desk guy, you know, the analysis desk, In Control was the best. Just because of his ability to joke around and bring up others with his wit and humor. So without him, not only is it just a matter of, well, In Control's not around and that sucks because he was so good, but because he was so good at bringing up others around him, the overall product was significantly decreased. If you look at a guy like Maynard or Nathanius, these are guys that really, really need a guy like In Control to help raise them up. You know, you listen to Nathanius, it's just not particularly inspired. He's not really funny. He has sort of a shrill voice. He doesn't say anything particularly memorable or inspired. He doesn't really talk about the metagame in an adequate way that's educational. When you compare him to a guy like Artosis, who not only has a extremely comprehensive viewpoint of the metagame for the last 9 years, okay, as well as the flavor of the month of what's going on now, Artosis is able to frame his knowledge in an incredibly funny way that is relatable, and a way that you can really sink your teeth into comedically, whereas guys like Nathanius, Mayonnaise, Rotterdam, it's not that these guys are like really bad casters, they're just not particularly inspired. They're not going to say anything memorable. I can remember jokes that Artosis made from 4 years ago. Things that he said that were really memorable and funny. I can remember whenever Flash and J-Dong were playing in the ASL years ago, at one point in the pregame lobby he said, "When I was a kid, I would always wish that my life was like Dragon Ball Z." And that's just such a funny little quip that you would throw in before a game. And you could really tell that Mayonnaise and Nathanius were really trying to crank it up to 11 and be the best of the best. They were sort of spitting these jokes that you could tell that they had been thinking about beforehand, really trying to step up their game for BlizzCon, and a lot of it just fell flat. Whenever I was listening to it, I sort of just thought, like, that's the sort of thing you should be saying in every cast. You know, these jokes aren't good enough to be reserved for the end of BlizzCon, the absolute best of the best. Artosis killed it as usual. Tasteless was good as well, but for whatever reason, Artosis and Tasteless, they didn't really cast enough. Like, yes, they were there at the event. A lot of times they were at the desk, though. Whereas if I were organizing a StarCraft 2 event and I had Tasteless and Artosis, it would pretty much be like, okay, those are the best casters in the world. You two are pretty much going to cast every single game you can, and obviously you have to give them time for breaks and whatnot, so they're not literally going to cast every single game, but they should be casting as many games as possible on the main stage, and I think we have really fallen off a long way in the scene whenever you look at the casting talent represented at BlizzCon. I mean, Day 9 wasn't there. When in the past you would think, well, who's going to be at Day 9? Who's going to be at BlizzCon, rather? Tasteless and Artosis for sure. That's just a given because of the best, but Day 9's also going to be there. And historically, if you just look at the people that have casted StarCraft 2, a lot of them are better than, quote-unquote, the best of the best. You know, you look at Idra and his casting career, knew way more about the game than basically anyone not named Tasteless or Artosis. He was more funny than anyone not named Tasteless or Artosis. You look at Mr. Bitter, which it blows my mind that Mr. Bitter and Rotterdam were a casting combo, and it's 7 years later, and Rotterdam was the guy who got the full-time casting gig, not Mr. Bitter, the funnier, more well-spoken of the two. I mean, Rotterdam still speaks with a thick accent, and he's been casting for like 9 years. Are you kidding me? You look at Artosis, a guy that was born in Massachusetts, used to have a heavy Boston accent, and like a good caster, he has completely dropped the accent. You can't even tell where he's from. That's what a good caster does, is he drops his accent, and it makes it impossible for you to figure out where he's from. Rotterdam, no, he still can't even say the word 3. So the casting wasn't that good, the allocation of casting resources wasn't that good. Now let's look at the way that Blizzard treated the game. And the corny little recap video they didn't even mention Dark or StarCraft 2. If you look at the games they announced, oh yeah, they announced Diablo 4, which Diablo 3 in general was a pretty big failure, pretty boring, whether it be the awful launch or the jokish auction house for real-life money. They announced a World of Warcraft expansion. Ooh, great, yeah, really riveting. And Warcraft 3 was sort of already known about, whatever. I don't really care anything about Warcraft. If you weren't aware, Warcraft is essentially an RTS game for the people who don't have the mechanics to play StarCraft, okay? Let's just keep it a stack. And furthermore, they canceled the jokish StarCraft shooter, which I'm glad they canceled because frankly that was never going to be anything more than Joker Watch Lite. And they straight up announced Joker Watch 2, which is bad in the sense that it wasn't a StarCraft game, it wasn't StarCraft 3, but considering the quote-unquote StarCraft shooter was going to be nothing more than Overwatch 2, I'm glad they just rebranded it Overwatch 2. And Overwatch is essentially a joke FPS game masquerading as an esport. It doesn't even have a scoreboard. If you notice here in StarCraft, we got the supplies, the money count of each player, as well as a plethora of interesting tabs that help us decide who is behind and ahead. Overwatch doesn't have that. Overwatch capitalizes on a League of Legends-esque philosophy that basically minimizes responsibility for players and makes it where the player base is always blaming their allies, because if you don't have a scoreboard and you have a player bottom fragging, it's sort of like a puzzle for your own team to figure out, well, why are we losing? There's no scoreboard. But if you had a scoreboard, you would be able to see, oh, our McCree is 1-6 and needs to change. But instead, Blizzard knows that you can keep a dim-witted player base around if you can perpetually keep them blaming this made-up lie called toxicity. There's no such thing as toxicity. People can be meanie heads on the internet, but this idea of toxicity, that someone's saying something mean to you or someone's saying you need to change roles in a game, is just so damning and awful that it's going to pollute you as a person and make you toxic. And then you're going to go into your next game and be toxic, and it just spreads like a virus. This is the laughable meme that Riot Games has been pushing for years to keep their player base in the dark. This is something that we see promoted heavily against within multiplayer games as Maru taps out there, and it's something that we're going to see in Joker Watch 2 that we saw in the original. And this runs contrary to the StarCraft mindset of you're playing a 1v1 game and you have to take accountability for your own actions and really look inwardly at your own micro and macro to try to improve. So a lot of Blizzard fans and StarCraft fans are really disappointed at no announcement for StarCraft 3, no announcement of anything StarCraft wise. A lot of the StarCraft 2 devs that a lot of people had faith in have left the company, whether it be quitting or getting shit canned. And if you play the new Call of Duty game, which of course is on the Battle.net launcher, and sort of you can look at in a way that relates to Blizzard a little bit. It's not necessarily lined straight up with the StarCraft scene, but the new Call of Duty game is an absolute catastrophe. They fucked up the most basic of things, so a lot of people are really worried about the future of StarCraft 2. They're worried because Blizzard didn't really acknowledge the game in any meaningful way, and they're worried the money that Blizzard is pumping into the scene is going to dry up. So I think that if you really like and care about this game, you don't really have to worry about that, because people like me, people like Artosis, they're always going to be involved in this game because they really care. But if you're one of these people on Reddit posting about balance and you don't actually play the game and you're sort of just pretending to be a fan, you watch a tournament once in a blue moon and think you know about balance, and you play 5 1v1 ladder matches every 6 months and you want to comment about what you think is broken, these are the people really terrified that Blizzard didn't mention StarCraft a lot. Anyway, it's just a little bit of food for thought. BlizzCon, frankly, this year really disappointing, and that's just the truth. VenomousStare, I always tell it to you like it is. Subscribe for more.